Okay, hey, train your plants every day. Jordan School coming at you from the STEM lab with the Uncrackable code number 2. Okay, so we're gonna crack into a different book before I really get into any of this, and you're gonna find me doing that a lot. Eventually, you're gonna see me grabbing other books alongside a lot of this, and it's gonna look like I'm doing magic tricks in front of you because I'm gonna be grabbing so much, I'm gonna be pulling stuff out of the air. Like I'm pulling code out of the air, like I'm creating a message out of nothing, taking all this and just changing it. Very important to understand those things. So, I think where we left off was we kind of got into the general relativity idea. Now, we talked about superstring theory a little bit, how these ideas are spectrum games and general relativity, the cranking of the sun gear tells you the mass because of the planets of the sun, the mass of the sun because of the orbital rotation of the planets and things like that. But there's also another important part of this. Now, Murphy's Law comes up in mind, and two parts. This is that AX, BY, AX, BX, or well, AX, BX, AX, BY system. Now, there's two types of Murphy's Law. Firstly, the one everybody should understand is if it can, it will. Go wrong, go right. Sometimes that's the difference. Sometimes it's not always, if it can go wrong, it will go wrong. If you don't think there's a guy out there that'll do it, and it does, well, it did what it went wrong, right? So it's that quantum entanglement game. And the other side of that is this is a rapid deceleration of forces. Alright, and now that is the actual physicist behind the rocket engineering of this rapid deceleration of this rocket. You know, sometimes gravity is going to be involved, the laws of motion, air turbulence equations, volume reduction, whatever. The physical equations that go from this term environmentally to be this term, and they're same change flip base between, got to be two different things. They can't be the same A 0 0 0 0 1 1 1 1 1. They can't be those things. They have to transmit. They have to substitute one another. And you have to have generals to be able to handle this kind of thing. In a way, it's a lie to the system, but it's the only logical system that'll allow it. Thermodynamics, against the laws of motion, when you reduce the equation, is still the laws of motion. You're just talking about it in a different field where the change flipped into specifically a special engineered or special relativity case of general relativity and the forces and physics and the laws of motion. It can be a mind bender, but it's the way you can crack this game. You can go to war with this system, understand it correctly. You can leave all the statues standing and stand there with it, but know you have to tear some stuff down. How do you use that? Well, thermodynamics didn't replace the laws of motion. It works parallelly with it in this special relativity notation. Empathy, enthropes, things like that are very important to understand code correctly. You have a certain amount of space. You have certain numbers of particles, points, dimensions that have to parallelly represent a battlefield, numbers of forces, dollar bills, whatever the case may be. Does not matter in this universe, if you will. But yet, it certainly applies as the universe. It's a rapid deceleration, and a lot of people get this wrong in the way they understand it. Now, I joke about Murphyverse, right? You know, so zombie apocalypse and what have you. I like to have fun with it, but this is how you step out of that game. You got to understand what you got around you is basically code all around you. In superstring theory, we talk about this a lot with this holographic principle of the surface of a black hole. Well, essentially, what you're looking at here is the surface of a black hole. You have all the information imprinted onto it, condensed down to super condensed points, or the super condensate that actually has a physical event horizon. That's what we perceive it to be. We can't look past that at this point without the proper coordinates or calculations, but we know it's physical. We know that it exists, that there's time dilations, that there's space dilations, that time and space flip here, and we do that with the mathematics. by understanding that that is a code psychologically and how we understand these things. It rapidly decelerates this stuff to a point where we can handle it. But it also is traveling causally at the speed of light, that any point can be any other point at any given time, and this code actually physically represents that. Not only Murphy there, he, and I do something very similar with it. I consider it my own Murphy's Law in the way I describe points and dimensions and superstring theory. Instead of rocket deceleration or rocket acceleration, I use it to describe direct physics. Things in the work site. I'm a stonemason, so I work in a stone dock, working with saws and torches and forklifts and shit that'll kill you all day. I use these principles as ideas that help me better calculate my time systems, my STEM systems, my space management, my things like that, which are important concepts to understand. This is a handy little tool. Practice, art, the design principles that when you're doing it, it becomes more than code. It's important to know that. So, see if I can cover a little bit more information inside of that before we get off onto something else. I wanted to talk specifically about Murphy's Law. Now, Murphy there, he had one guy on his crew. Put the sensor on backwards or what have you. And what he got out of that was more benefit, in some regards, than a negative feature. That's the game mathematically. Sometimes the negatives we learn from this. And I'm not going to give you the motivational quote bullshit. What I'm going to give you is the aspect of, well, what you get out of this is this actual point dimension. One point into this fractal system, into this next, but has a special relativity variable, this rocket. That's what we got to build. That is the goal. That is what CZ is on the other end. Everything can happen at the speed of light in between those and those fractal frames. Or it can happen physically at the speed of light. Here we do things physically. We just don't perceive them as being happening at causal speed of light. We don't recognize that. But this motion right here has a butterfly effect all the way downrange. There's ways to get around that with Euclidean steps and things like that you can do, but basically they're just transpositions of a physical. Sun Tzu says it with there are two types of war. There is direct and indirect. Well, reality tells us that there is no indirect model. It is just a physical Euclidean jump in a direct frame based in direct physics points and calculations that tells us that that is actually the smoothest move to have the best result, because there are multiple spectrums and divergent principles to the end result while this rocket is traveling downrange. To really understand rocket science or anything like that, you should know this stuff. It's not just build this rocket, there's this chemical reaction of liquid hydrogen or solid hydrogen, and how to condense it to do all that, to get it there, to be able to keep it stable, to make it go downrange. I mean, even if you don't know where you're shooting it, Murphy's Law is still going to apply that. Rapid deceleration from this positive continuance to not no more. Or even within the frame of wanting it to do this, to expect it to do this and have those energies transmit to a new state of matter, to a new state of this not really being matter, but this parallel model of it causally. To say, I don't want it to continue anymore, the rocket fuel burned out, but it should be right where I want it to be, even though the rocket isn't doing what I want it to do anymore. I still understood those calculations well enough that I knew them before I put it there, that now it's going to continue with no deceleration, zero. This is an amechanical transposition system. So, before we get into code, we're going to know some other things real quickly here. This is my trainer's guide to help understand a lot of this. Firstly, the STEM problems. To get into this, we talk about this in terms of, encoded in this guide, you'll find the base, and I talk about this in BACE, this survival anagram if you understand Army psychology. You survey your resources, you utilize your resources, or something along those lines. But anyways, this B and AB, A, CE, causally energy, causal environment system, this base, BACE. And this is the spectrum game of A mechanics, the process used to break down or build anything. To this concept, A refers to. It's a binary model, but 2 doesn't really exist. We're using this third dimension of A mechanics. A refers to the relative frames, this parallel causal system in this model, that 0 is 1, 1 is 0. Once I want to get to 1, that 0 is out the clock. It can be any number, any real rational number, and we're going to get into a lot of physics and a whole bunch of other jive when we do this. The irrational number, the golden ratio system, environment symbols, antimatter symbols, or anti-gravity systems, Planck symbols, whatever the game may be, Lapikins gradients, whatever you can find in your product value or your product rule equation in mathematics, or whatever one you hold in high regards. And we're going to break that down, and again we're going to see that this AX, BX, CX, AX, BY, CZ system applies as an entanglement model to a transposition code system that generally will apply to the special relativity cases. And you got to be a general to be able to handle these kinds of forces when they're moving. I'm telling you, man, it's for real. But to continue here, A refers to AMEC. With that said, we must start with a frame of motion. So we're going to go, any motion is not just an apple. It's not just a force equals this FMA equals F1, F2, F1 minus F2. Because that's basically what you have. Once you have this second plus this second, they're going to collide. It's not just an object or an apple. But once you have that new second that's integrated relative in the special relativity notation, the first second is dissolved. We don't have that model anymore. In the same way works to this code principle, and the way that once we've burned that code, it no longer applies. Can it? Certainly. I can go back and use the exact same thing, but you won't know that unless I specifically tell you to make it work that way. And it'll work in that base. Even though it's not always that system, it can be a randomly generated system. I can randomly generate it on the fly to any design principle that I want. It certainly can, and that's the way reality works. That's the way we generally perceive it anyways, that there is that option. It's mathematical and pretense. It can change to different code sequences, but still have a code system base and totally be random, and each step is a mathematical frame. This is a note basis, or a superstring theory principle. And I like how I describe to do this, because this is that when you start to understand the STEM problems, they'll actually talk about one with the P versus NP problem, with the understanding of how we perceive this mathematics, or how, if I can find it real quickly here. P versus NP problem, or Young's-Meaul's mass gap, excuse me, will require the introduction of fundamental new ideas to both physics and mathematics. This is what that is. Basically, we're using a superstring theory principle to talk about erodes. And we're going to break that down in a note dimensional spectrum. We're going to do the same thing with some of the basic ideas and the breakdown of erodes, Fermats, Beals. And as you break down a note or a code, you're going to do it the exact same way. As you break down a law of physics or cases where there's masses and gravity relative, they become this special relativity notation. They become this parallel frame to it with multiple dimensions and multiple points in the series of laws of motion of how this descriptive design is designed based off the abruptly sequences of terms. These terms are mathematical. A becomes UG, A becomes apple, A becomes general relativity. This mechanical sequence, whether it be general relativity, the laws of motion, a physical marshmallow, or a physical psychology marshmallow experiment, are broken down the exact same way. And these terms are going to be very important.